Chuck Berry played the worst guitar of his life in 1962, a $12 pawnshop piece of junk with missing strings and a neck so warped it buzzed on every fret. But that night became his most legendary performance. After the show, Chuck stared at that broken guitar and said something that every musician needs to hear. Then he named it Humility and kept it for 55 years until the day he died. Here's why that garbage guitar mattered more than any Gibson ever could. It was August 23rd, 1962, at the Riverside Theater in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Chuck Berry was at the height of his powers. Johnny B. Good was a massive hit. Roll Over Beethoven was a standard. Every guitarist in America was trying to copy his sound. He was selling out venues across the country, and tonight was no exception. 2,000 tickets sold. Standing room only. The biggest show Milwaukee had seen all year. Chuck had a ritual before every performance. He'd arrive at the venue 2 hours early. He'd set up his equipment personally. Nobody else touched his gear. And most importantly, he'd spend 30 minutes alone with his guitar, a cherry red Gibson ES 355 that he'd owned for 5 years. That guitar was his baby. Custom setup, perfect action, tone that could make a grown man cry. He knew every inch of that instrument. It was an extension of his body. That afternoon, Chuck followed his ritual exactly. He arrived at 4 p.m. for the 7 p.m. show, set up his amplifier, tested the sound system. Then he went to his dressing room to relax before the pre-show routine with his Gibson. At 6:30 p.m., 30 minutes before showtime, Chuck went to get his guitar. It was gone. The case was there, lying open on the floor, but the guitar, his Gibson, his baby, the instrument he'd played on every hit record, every major show for 5 years, was just gone. Chuck felt his stomach drop. He looked around the dressing room like maybe he'd moved it and forgotten. Checked the bathroom. Looked under furniture. Nothing. "Joe," he called to his road manager. "Where's my guitar?" Joe came running. "What do you mean? It was right there in the case." "Well, it's not there now." They searched everywhere, asked everyone backstage. Nobody had seen anything. Security checked the exits. The guitar was simply gone. Someone had walked into Chuck's dressing room in the 30 minutes he'd stepped out and stolen a $3,000 Gibson ES 355. The venue manager was apologetic but clear. "Mr. Berry, we've got 2,000 people out there. We can call the police, file a report, but the show starts in 25 minutes. Chuck sat down heavily in a chair. He felt physically sick. "I can't play without my guitar. That's my sound. That's my instrument. I can't just grab any guitar and play like Chuck Berry." The manager looked panicked. "We'll find you something. There has to be a guitar store nearby." "It's 6:35 on a Thursday night," Joe said. "Everything's closed." They sat in desperate silence for about 30 seconds. Then a young stagehand named Tommy, maybe 19 years old, spoke up from the doorway. "There's a pawn shop 2 blocks away," Tommy said. "They stay open until 7. I could run over there, see if they have anything." Chuck looked at this kid. "A pawn shop? You think a pawn shop is going to have anything worth playing? It's better than nothing." Tommy said, "I can be back in 10 minutes." Chuck waved his hand. "Go. Anything is better than canceling." Tommy ran. Actually ran. Full sprint down the street. Chuck sat in his dressing room, head in his hands, trying not to think about the fact that he was about to walk on stage in front of 2,000 people without the instrument that defined his sound. 8 minutes later, Tommy burst back through the door, breathing hard, carrying a battered guitar case. Got one, he said, gasping. Only one they had. He opened the case, and Chuck's heart sank even further. The guitar was a disaster. It looked like it had been dropped, kicked, left in the rain, and then donated to the pawn shop out of pity. It was a cheap hollow-body electric brand name Chuck didn't even recognize. The finish was scratched and faded. 3 of the 6 strings were broken, just dangling there, useless. The neck had a visible warp to it. One of the tuning pegs was missing its knob. The bridge was loose and rattling. Chuck picked it up and nearly laughed at how light it was. Cheap wood, cheap hardware, cheap everything. He tried to strum it. The broken strings flapped pathetically. The ones that were intact buzzed against the frets because of the warped neck. "How much did you pay for this?" Chuck asked. $12, Tommy said. "It's all they had. I grabbed the only set of strings they sold too, but I didn't have time to." $12, Chuck repeated. He looked at the guitar, then looked at the clock. 5 minutes until showtime. "This is garbage. This is literally garage sale garbage." "I know, Mr. Berry. I'm sorry, but how fast can you change strings?" Tommy blinked. "What? I need you to put new strings on this thing right now. Fast as you can. I've got 5 minutes." Tommy and Joe went to work like a NASCAR pit crew. They pulled off the broken strings, wound on new ones, tuned as best they could, despite the warped neck and questionable tuning pegs. Chuck stood there watching, feeling like he was about to go into battle with a weapon made of cardboard. At 6:58, with 2 minutes until showtime, the guitar had 6 functioning strings. Sort of, they'd tuned it as close as possible, but the warped neck meant some notes just weren't going to be right. The action was terrible. Too high in some places, too low in others. Every note buzzed. The tone was thin and tinny, compared to his Gibson's rich, full sound. Chuck strapped it on. It felt wrong. Too light, too cheap, too broken. "You can cancel," the venue manager said. "We'll refund tickets, reschedule." Chuck thought about it. He really did. 2,000 people who'd paid good money to see Chuck Berry. This guitar was an insult to them. It was an insult to him. How was he supposed to play Johnny B. Good on this piece of junk? But then he heard it. Through the walls, the sound of 2,000 people clapping, stomping, chanting his name. They were excited. They'd been waiting for this. They didn't know his guitar had been stolen. They just knew Chuck Berry was about to take the stage. "I'm going out there," Chuck said. He walked to the stage entrance. The announcer's voice boomed. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Chuck Berry." The crowd erupted. Chuck walked into the spotlight carrying a $12 pawn shop guitar that buzzed on every note and felt like a toy in his hands. The audience didn't know. They just saw Chuck Berry, and they went crazy. Chuck stepped up to the microphone, looked out at those 2,000 faces, and realized something that terrified him. He couldn't rely on his equipment tonight. He couldn't count on his familiar Gibson to deliver the tone he knew. He couldn't play his usual way. He was going to have to make it work through pure soul. He started with Roll Over Beethoven. From the first note, the guitar sounded wrong. Too bright, too buzzy, too thin, but Chuck leaned into it. He attacked those strings harder than he normally would. He bent notes further to compensate for the tuning issues. When the guitar buzzed on a fret, he used it, made it part of the sound, made it aggressive and raw, and something magical happened. The audience didn't care that the tone was different. They cared about the energy, the passion, the way Chuck was throwing everything into every note because he had to. There was no safety net, No perfect equipment to hide behind. Just him and a broken guitar, fighting to make music happen. He did his duck walk across the stage, and the crowd lost their minds. The guitar was so light and cheap. It was actually easier to move with. He could be more physical, more theatrical. Between songs, he had to retune constantly, because the bad tuning pegs wouldn't hold. He made jokes about it. Bear with me, folks. This guitar's got a mind of its own tonight. The audience laughed with him, not at him. He played Johnny B. Good. And here's where it got interesting. His usual guitar solo relied on clean, precise notes. But this guitar wouldn't do clean. The warped neck made precision impossible. So Chuck changed his approach. He got rawer, bluesier, more emotional. He bent strings until they screamed. He used the guitar's flaws, the buzz, the rattle, the imperfections, and turned them into character. It was the most stripped-down, visceral version of Johnny B. Good he'd ever played. And the audience went absolutely berserk. By the end of the 90-minute set, Chuck was drenched in sweat. He'd worked harder than he'd worked in years because every single note required extra effort, extra soul, extra commitment. He couldn't coast on equipment. He had to pour himself into every moment. When he walked off stage, the applause was deafening. The venue manager was grinning. That was incredible. Best show we've ever had here. Chuck went back to his dressing room and sat down, still holding the $12 guitar. He looked at it, really looked at it. For the first time, all the scratches, the warped neck, the cheap hardware, the buzzing frets. This piece of garbage had just given him the most important musical lesson of his career. His Gibson was a beautiful instrument. Perfect tone, perfect setup, perfect everything. And because it was perfect, Chuck had started to rely on it. He'd let the equipment do some of the work. He'd gotten comfortable. This broken pawn shop guitar couldn't do any of the work. It could barely hold tune. Every note was a fight, and because of that, Chuck had to bring more of himself to the performance. More soul, more energy, more commitment. He'd been a better musician tonight with a $12 piece of junk than he'd been with a $3,000 Gibson. Not because the guitar was better, but because it forced him to be better. Tommy knocked on the door. "Mr. Berry, I can try to find your Gibson. File a police report, whatever you need." Chuck looked up at him. "Keep the $12. This guitar's mine now." "What?" "I'm buying it." "Well, you already bought it. I'm keeping it." Chuck stood up, still holding the guitar. "What's your full name, Tommy?" "Thomas Mitchell, sir." "Tommy, I want you to get me a black marker." Tommy came back with a Sharpie. Chuck took it and wrote directly on the guitar's body, right across the scratched finish in his own handwriting. "Humility. That's this guitar's name," Chuck said. "And I'm keeping it forever." He did too. Chuck Berry recovered his Gibson a week later. Police found it in a pawn shop 3 towns over. But he never forgot that night in Milwaukee. And he never let that $12 guitar out of his sight for the remaining 55 years of his life. He kept it in his home studio in St. Louis. When young guitarists would visit and ask about his gear, about what guitar they should buy, what amp, what effects, Chuck would walk them over to Humility and tell them the story. "You see this guitar," he'd say. "This is garbage. $12. Warped neck. Buzzes on every fret. Worst guitar I ever played. And it gave me the best show of my career." You know why? The young guitarists would shake their heads. "Because it couldn't do the work for me. I had to do the work. I had to bring the soul. I had to make every note matter because the guitar sure wasn't going to help me." He'd let them hold it. Feel how light and cheap it was. You want to be a great guitarist? Chuck would say. Stop worrying about gear. Stop thinking you need the perfect instrument to make great music. The music comes from here, he'd tap his chest. Not from here. He'd tap the guitar. Equipment is just equipment. It's you that makes it sing. It's your soul that people hear. He'd point to the word humility, written on the guitar. This guitar taught me to stay humble, to remember that no matter how famous I got, no matter how many hit records I had, I was only as good as the soul I brought to every performance. Not the gear, the soul. When Chuck Berry died in 2017 at age 90, his family found dozens of expensive guitars in his collection. Custom Gibsons, rare vintage models, beautiful instruments worth thousands of dollars. But sitting in a place of honor in his studio, in a special stand with a light on it, was a beat-up pawnshop guitar with humility written in black marker across its scratched body. His son Charles Jr. said at the funeral, "Dad kept that guitar closer than any other instrument he owned. He said it was his most valuable guitar, even though it cost $12 and sounded terrible. He said it taught him the most important lesson of his life, that greatness doesn't come from your equipment. It comes from your willingness to pour your soul into whatever you have, no matter how broken or imperfect it might be." The lesson of humility is one every musician needs to hear. We obsess over gear. We convince ourselves we need the perfect guitar, the perfect amp, the perfect setup, before we can make great music. We use equipment as an excuse. I could be good if I just had better gear. Chuck Berry proved that's backwards. You don't need great gear to be great. You need to be great regardless of your gear. In fact, sometimes the worst equipment can bring out the best in you, because it forces you to rely on the only thing that really matters. Your soul. The $12 guitar that Chuck named Humility and kept for 55 years is now in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It sits in a display case, looking exactly as broken and cheap as it did that night in Milwaukee. The warped neck, the scratched finish, the word humility in fading black marker, and the plaque beneath it reads, "The guitar that taught Chuck Berry his most important lesson. Great musicians don't need great gear. Great gear needs great musicians." If this story changed how you think about equipment and soul, subscribe for more untold stories about the lessons that shaped music legends. Share it with a musician who's waiting for perfect gear before they start creating. Drop a comment about a time you created something great with imperfect tools. And hit that notification bell for more stories about what really makes greatness. It's never the equipment.